Please note, at the very end of this video there will be a short section which does include full spoilers for Metroid Prime 4, including the ending. The rest of the video does not contain spoilers. After 8.5 years of waiting, Metroid Prime 4 is out to broadly positive, but in some cases, mixed reviews. But why is the game as it is? What can we infer about the long and arduous journey it took? In this video, I want to exhaustively deep dive the development of Metroid Prime 4, trying to identify what happened when, what the obstacles and issues might have been. In a lot of cases, we have hard data to piece together from job listings, hiring news, interviews, and announcements, but it will likely be years, if ever, before we know the true ins and outs. I suspect the confidentiality clauses for Nintendo are stronger than ever these days, after all. Therefore, at certain points it will be necessary to speculate about different possible explanations for what might have happened at different stages of development, and you can make your own judgments as to which feel more or less plausible. By the end of the video, though, I hope we will have built a picture of the history of Metroid Prime 4's development, some potential context for some of the game's great strengths and oft-identified weaknesses, and we will look at where this positions Metroid Prime and Retro Studios going forward. Let's start at the very beginning. And the beginning in this case is the release of the previous mainline Metroid Prime title, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. On that game, there were 76 people credited to Retro Studios specifically, excluding the contract positions and voice acting credits and not including people at Nintendo Company Limited, Nintendo of America, and so on. 18 years later, only 21 of these Retro Studios staff members will be credited again on Metroid Prime 4, plus a further 5 who were contract people on Prime 3 but became core staff members for Prime 4. Nintendo had every hope that Prime 3 would be a success. Prime 1 had been fairly successful on GameCube proportionate to its install base, the 6th best-selling game on the system. Prime 3 had a new control system that modelled the Wii's unique capability to provide intuitive gameplay, and the system was white-hot in terms of popularity, constantly selling out throughout 2007. A huge install base might be just what Metroid Prime needed to finally hit the big time. Evidently, this was not to be. Metroid Prime 3 Corruption racked up 1.41 million in recorded sales, though Trilogy probably nudged that up a little bit as well. The narrative we have for what followed is fairly straightforward, and while I don't doubt its truth, I'd also note that it may be a partial accounting, favouring interpretations that are more convenient and face-saving. The account is that Retro had the idea initially of making Metroid Prime into a trilogy, but then felt burnt out on the project and wanted to try something new, which led them to inherit Donkey Kong Country. However, Nintendo usually do like to keep their developers on the same project, or at least have them alternate between different projects while still keeping their hand in with a particular idea. Series producer Kensuke Tanabe also had Next Level Games alternate between Luigi's Mansion and non-Luigi's Mansion projects through the 2010s. The Pikmin group also did Mario Maker and 2D Mario, while the Splatoon team went over to do Animal Crossing. But there always seems to be a core of developers working on ideas for each franchise in the meantime. The thing is, I struggle to think that Kensuke Tanabe wasn't at least noodling around concepts for what Metroid Prime 4 might be, even as far back as Prime 3's release, even if the expectation was that Retro would get to work on something different for their next game. If Prime 3 had matched the original game's attach rate, it would have had 13 million in sales, being the 9th best-selling system on the Wii ahead of Super Mario Galaxy, and I suspect Retro and Nintendo would have found a way to keep the show on the road, even if it meant next-level game-style concurrent projects or just expanding the studio. Shigeru Miyamoto commented in the early 2010s that Retro was capable of having concurrent projects by this point. But it wasn't to be, and I think Nintendo went deeply internal to reflect on the nature of Metroid. Kensuke Tanabe was moved off Metroid, and Yoshio Sakamoto, who had handled the 2D games but had failed to get Metroid Dread off the ground, appeared to be tasked with thinking of how to take the franchise forward. In the Iwata Asks for Other M, Satoru Iwata noted that Yoshio Sakamoto was thinking about the concept of what is Metroid, and this is a very common starting place for Nintendo. Similarly, what is Mario, what is Zelda, and what is Donkey Kong phrases were accounted in developer interviews for titles like Super Mario Sunshine, Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Donkey Kong Bonanza. They always like to get to the core truth of their franchises and of their series, and so it makes perfect sense for them to start with what is Metroid after a period of having games which were less than successful. Iwata phrases it as Sakamoto taking the initiative to think this through, but this is Japanese etiquette. I have no proof but strongly suspect that the top brass at Nintendo would have said to Sakamoto, "This isn't working, we need to make Metroid work in Japan, we need you to fix it." And who do they put on it? Why, the head of the most celebrated game in the series, Super Metroid, and the person who has the longest history on the franchise. Other M was a second attempt to birth Metroid into the 3D space and to appeal now to Japanese gamers with a focus on the woman behind the mask. It was an understandable ambition, but clearly it did not ultimately work. Now, what is not recorded but seems plausible to me is that perhaps Nintendo didn't have just one pitch in 2008, but two. What if both Sakamoto and Tanabe were asked to find a way to reimagine Metroid and find a new direction for it? With the failure of Other M, they may well have turned to the second proposal, which would explain the rather odd emergence of Federation Force. Irrespective, when Other M failed, it led to what appears from the outside to be Metroid's only significant production lull in its history. Sakamoto wasn't working on a new Metroid, Tanabe wasn't working on a new Metroid, and even if there was interest, in 2011 Nintendo was in a parlous situation, with the Wii starting to seriously flag and the 3DS's launch far from secure. My guess, and it is pure guesswork, is that Nintendo would have had some form of proposal for Metroid being worked on in early 2011, because we know they have lots of prototypes, and they also have as an ongoing priority the wish to support and develop Metroid. It's almost always been in production, no matter how badly the previous games have performed. However, they also knew that Retro were otherwise engaged, Other M hadn't worked out, and the series needed even fresh thinking. I suspect that Tanabe at this point already knew he wanted to do a game with Federation soldiers stranded on an alien planet with Samus. Indeed, he told Eurogamer in 2015 that he had a concept for a game set on a singular planet with a time-shifting mechanic, and by that point he was working on Federation Force, and we know he had a strong interest in the Federation characters. That game probably entered development around 2013 after the release of Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, and was presumably the upshot of this drive to rethink Metroid. I can see the logic of broadening out the appeal of Metroid, particularly in Japan, with a multiplayer component and multiple characters, but evidently this initiative too failed. At the same time, Mercury Steam pitched a Metroid Fusion remake, and Nintendo countered with a Samus Returns remake, and suddenly Sakamoto was also back in the seat of the gunship. Mounting two Metroid projects at once may seem like an ambitious moment in Nintendo's really dark period during the 2010s, but I think there are very good reasons as to why they did this. Firstly, Metroid has a core fanbase, and so there was a reasonable expectation that a small but resilient audience might be of use to keeping the franchise afloat, given that the baseline audience of the 3DS and the Wii U are relatively small anyway. Secondly, they were by 2015 starting to reorientate as an IP-focused company with an interest in films, theme parks, and such like, and Samus's low sales have always belied her obviously high potential. Thirdly, though, they had both passionate producers in Sakamoto and Tanabe and interested production teams, and so the opportunity simply presented itself. Fourthly, they had obviously diversified their approaches with a highly experimental as well as a very traditional take on the game series. They had Federation Force and they had Samus Returns. If Federation Force was popular, it could be a new way to approach the franchise, but if it flopped, they always had Samus Returns up their sleeve, which was the first core Metroid experience for over a decade and would placate fans. As it turns out, neither Federation Force nor Samus Returns were great sellers, and the titles didn't even crack 1 million units combined on the 3DS, but I don't think the strategy was completely wrong, and curiously it didn't seem to put them off Metroid Prime 4 at all. Meanwhile, in America, Retro Studios seemed to have put Samus well behind them. By 2014, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze had finished development, and Retro were not headed back to Metroid Prime. In fact, they were starting an original project completely. I think them parting ways with Donkey Kong makes sense because they had already had Tropical Freeze on the low-selling Wii U, and by 2014, Nintendo must have anticipated that it might make a sensible port to their new system to try and give it a greater reach, given that it wasn't exactly shifting lots of copies on the Wii U. They were porting Donkey Kong Country Returns to 3DS, and that game had far greater sales on the Wii after all. Nintendo in the mid-2010s was in a real hole, and they needed to be creative. Splatoon and ARMS were both developed during this period by teams behind games as huge as Animal Crossing and Mario Kart. Having Retro also roll the dice on something new made far more sense than returning to Metroid Prime. Of course, the project didn't ultimately pan out, but that's the nature of having things that are experimental. Sometimes the experiments fail. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea to try them. At this point, Retro Studios was reportedly not in an enormously good situation in any event. In the credits to Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, the studio credits a total number of 86 members of staff plus 15 contract positions. Their new project, their game with musical elements called Harmony, seemed to be promising but ultimately was cancelled by some reports quite far into development in 2017 or 2018. Meanwhile, Nintendo were really at their lowest ebb financially in the mid-2010s. If you look at the games they had on their slate, there were the huge 2017 titles, but despite popular recollection, these were very carefully spaced out, and there weren't really that many. After launch, it was 3 months before they released another fully original game. 2018's Switch lineup comprised smaller games and a bunch of ports. Nevertheless, they were obviously targeting Switch development for 2019, and we can see that a huge number of games were put into production around this time, presumably reflecting the fact that the early Switch sales figures were strong enough to mean that they could put their full effort into developing for the singular system and cut loose the 3DS. I suspect Tanabe in late 2016 was putting together his pitch for what he wanted to do, but I rather doubt a formal commission for Metroid Prime 4 took place until they started to see the initial success of the Switch from pre-orders. It probably helped that Switch put Zelda onto the map in a huge way, and therefore drove interest in Metroid as another major Nintendo franchise. Tanabe by this point had probably had about a decade to think through his next Metroid Prime. However, this was also the time period where Nintendo was focused very much on openness. Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey were both focusing on more open, sandboxy experiences, and they had seemingly become converts to this style of game, with the concept of play your way eventually becoming a heartland message to sell the Switch family of systems. Pokemon in 2019 would have a more open area. Paper Mario moved towards more open areas in 2020, and the Donkey Kong game that they were prototyping, which would become Bonanza, had this philosophy at its heart as well. It's not that every game would be a complete open world, of course, but there was evidently a move across the company to embrace a greater sense of player freedom as part of their strategy for their games and for the system. The problem, of course, is that Metroidvanias are by definition the opposite of open. You need a strict structure and a dense map to make backtracking work and to allow for progression to feel seamless. Making Zelda, Mario, and Pokemon more open didn't cause any intrinsic problems. Indeed, Mario 64 and the very original 1986 Zelda were far more open than recent games in the series have become. But while Zelda had borrowed more and more from Metroid in terms of how to structure item progression and tightness of design as the years progressed, having the direction of influence turn the other way was always going to be extremely difficult for a franchise like Metroid. Who was working on this early 2017 3D Metroid project? Likely it was a very small core team, possibly just Tanabe and Risa Tabata as the lead producers, with a few other people probably from the credits that we can see. So Takayoshi Sato and Kotei Kimamura with the artistic vision, Kyohei Minato from the engineering team, and probably a big early input from Takahiro Dota, who was coming off Zelda Breath of the Wild and was soon to become the head of EPD's technology department. Now at this point, there are two major approaches that they could have taken. We know whatever approach they took effectively failed, so it's impossible to really know which one they approached, but here they are. Option 1, they could have taken a bold step forward and looked to rethink the conventions of Metroid Prime fundamentally in the manner of Breath of the Wild. Option 2, they could have decided on a far more traditional, modest version of the game, keeping to the kind of scale that we've seen previously. Now obviously, there are a range of possibilities between these two, but these represent the major two choices that were open to Nintendo. My guess is that Tanabe would have wanted something more in line with the originals because he obviously had long-term ideas for what Metroid Prime 4 could be, and Nintendo tends to be very reverential towards its top talent, giving them great free rein. They also had come off the back of 2 consecutive failures, Other M and Federation Force, and they really needed Metroid to chalk up some wins. On the other hand, they might have felt that the time was right for Nintendo to be bold and at least try something new with Metroid. The success of Breath of the Wild would have outweighed any number of potential failed Zelda experiments financially. Risky moves can be worth it if the upside is large enough, and in this period Nintendo were used to taking risks and they were starting to win big. They might even have been buoyed by the success of Samus Return's development and the prospects of them finally realizing Metroid Dread on their new console once that game finished, meaning that they could couple a traditional 2D entry with a non-traditional 3D one during the middle period of the Switch's life. Plus, the concept of remastering Prime 1 must have been in the air by this point, with Retro's music-based project being scrapped in 2017 or 2018, meaning that they would have had a trad core gamer experience if they decided to make Metroid Prime 4 a more radical departure. Now, there's evidence against a more radical 2017 version as well. One point is the fact that the game was advertised not as a new kind of Metroid, but simply as Metroid Prime. But then again, Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild were both Legend of Zelda games. The Thousand Year Door and Color Splash were both Paper Mario titles. The series can contain multitudes, and in any event, if the idea of releasing the news of this game so early was to reassure fans, announcing it as a different kind of Metroid was likely to do the exact opposite and would have been utterly counterproductive. It kind of had to be announced as Metroid Prime. Now, the way Nintendo frequently work is that they like to see a core mechanic that drives a new player experience. A chemistry engine, destructible terrain, ultra hand, anti-gravity racers, and open world. The specific ideas are less important to our investigation here than the fact that there is a big concept driving a new trajectory when they develop these games. Metroid Prime 4 likely had such an idea driving its development early on. I would even venture what I freely admit is a total guess as to what the core concept of this prototype might have been. We know from Tears of the Kingdom and Donkey Kong Bonanza that Nintendo in 2018 were experimenting with unusual play mechanics at the center of their games, mechanics which allow for a far greater sense of control, and we have a kind of play mechanic like this at the center of Metroid Prime 4, the psychic abilities. I think it's possible to imagine how this could, at one stage, have been not just another type of visor, but a far more wide-reaching mechanic, closer to the Ultra Hand and the Bonanza destructible terrain, allowing more diverse manipulation of objects in the Prime world. Perhaps they even wanted to take a leaf out of A Link Between Worlds and give Samus access to diverse powers early on, but require psychic power to be charged up to use them, thereby changing the gatekeeping system of a traditional Metroid entirely. If they did try something this radical, it's probably small wonder that it failed, given the difficulty of building openness into Metroid Prime, a series whose core design philosophy is based around an extremely tight structure. At any rate, we don't know what the 2017 version of the game was, but we have some hints as to what might have happened to it. It's often asserted, though I don't think we have any definitive confirmation, that Metroid Prime 4 was made in collaboration with Bandai Namco Singapore, although with Retro reportedly taking ever more of an interest in it. My hunch is that the Singaporean development was shorter than is often supposed. Bandai Namco Singapore worked on Mario Sports Superstars, which released in March 2017, and they were also on Monster Hunter World, which released in January 2018. If Metroid Prime 4 was commissioned formally at the start of the 2017-18 financial year, following on from the successful launch of the Switch, Bandai Namco might not have been available to start gearing up until the summer or even the late period of 2017. Yes, it's odd and relatively un-Nintendo-like to announce a game so incredibly early, but they did the same with Bayonetta and even with Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. At this point in the life of the Switch, Nintendo desperately needed hype to paper over the fact that once 2017 ended, they had basically got Kirby, Yoshi, Mario Tennis, Mario Party, Smash, and Fire Emblem to tide them over an 18-month window, and Fire Emblem, after all, ended up slipping out of that window. Everything else was a port, a third-party collaboration, including stuff by the Pokemon Company, or something niche and possibly low budget like Labo. Announcing Metroid Prime also provided cover fire and good promotion for Samus Returns. It was a risk, but a calculated one, and I suspect one they ultimately came to regret. By late 2018, we know that Retro's Project Harmony had been officially cancelled, and I've seen suggestions that Retro was already helping fighting fires on Metroid Prime 4. The decision was clearly made to pivot to Retro as the major developers and to reboot the project, and Shinya Takahashi's announcement of the reboot came in January 2019. How quickly the announcement came after the change is difficult to say, but a logical review window for a game would be the end of the quarter, and so if the contract with Bandai Namco formally expired at the end of December, this freed Takahashi up to make the announcement at the end of January. Metroid Prime Remastered was presumably substantially underway by this point as well, so it's unlikely that for 2019, Metroid Prime 4 was the primary concern of either Nintendo or Retro. It seems that Remaster was locked in 2021, but I would guess that it was held to the end of the following financial year to keep it out of the hype cycle of Metroid Dread. Remastered did benefit from extensive support from additional developers such as Iron Galaxy, but many of the key people from Prime 4 are still credited on Remastered, and so I think it's reasonable to think that Metroid Prime 4 was not the main focus of Retro's efforts during 2019. After all, the game needed a fundamental rethinking, and that means going back to the very core concept. So for that matter, did Retro, because they needed a bit of a rethink too. By 2025's credits on Metroid Prime 4, 43 of the 86 people who are core staff members of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze would still be credited, plus 5 of the 18 contractors. Now this represents a nearly 12-year gap, so it's not astonishing that there would be a turnover, but it's nonetheless a fairly radical change, especially in the context of a massive expansion of the studio which was about to take place. There are still senior people in most departments, but not all, and in some cases, they have almost no connection with the previous version of Retro. By Metroid Prime 4, one group that was almost entirely different was the art department, under Johnny Lundstedt, who reportedly was felt by Retro people to be a massive get for the company when he was hired in February 2020 as an art director, a key role in the development of the game. Still, with their department heads lined up by early 2020, Nintendo would have been ready to really start getting things nailed down, while the bulk of Retro worked on Remastered still. My guess is that the plan would have been a traditional 3-year development cycle once they properly had a working prototype up and running and ready to commit to full development of the game. Plan A might have been to have Remastered finished in 2021 and then Metroid Prime 4 for 2023, following on the heels of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom in 2022 and possibly taking advantage of a mid-gen refresh of the Switch that offered more power and released alongside Metroid Dread in 2021. This is all consistent with not just Retro's historic development trends, but the dev cycles of other games of similar importance and scope to Nintendo. Xenoblade games release every 2.5 years with a mix of remasters and full games, while Pikmin has been on a 3-year cycle since 2017 with Hey Pikmin, Pikmin 3 Deluxe, and Pikmin 4 in 2017, 2020, and 2023 respectively. But of course, then along came COVID. It's difficult to say exactly how this affected development, but I'm sure it did. As well as this in 2020, there must have been a real discussion about making sure that the game was going to be in good shape. I suspect Nintendo wanted the team to essentially provide a game that pleased core fans, and it also showed how Metroid Prime could move into the future and fit the openness and playfulness that had become their hallmark on the Nintendo Switch. Regular job advertisements continued to go out through the early 2020s, but we can see the outcome from the credits to the game. I've covered Metroid Prime 4's credits before, but with the time to scrutinize them more carefully, it appears that the core Retro Studio staff was far more modest than we have been led to imagine. There are 133 credits for full-time staff members on Metroid Prime 4. Now granted, there were also a goodly number of special thanks, which in the past have been used to indicate people who left during the extensive development period, and as with previous games, there are a number of contract positions. Of course, there are also many other people who are brought in to support, including Nintendo's own Next Level Games. Still, out of these 133 people, an enormous number were new to their positions. Nintendo internally and many of Nintendo's partners generally have had deep experience of the projects they're working on. Retro's staff needed to orientate themselves quickly while on the clock for one of Nintendo's most eagerly awaited projects. Metroid Prime Remastered must have helped in this endeavour, but it still would have been an uphill struggle. After a long period of getting the core design of Metroid Prime 4 absolutely right, though, 2021 was the point when Retro were properly focused on it, with Metroid Prime Remastered reportedly in the can, and by 2024 they were obviously competent enough to show substantial footage, albeit from the opening areas only. I would note though that the bike and desert were only shown in September 2025, incredibly late on, and while there's a simple explanation that you want to put your best looking stuff front and centre early on, it's also quite possible that the desert was still being worked on for a lot longer than anything else. Let's try to unpick what we know about the mid-development of this game, of the early 2020s at Retro. We have the core of the game, which we know is Post-Tanabe, the Federation force supporting Samus on an alien world. This is something he's talked about for a decade now. The host of the well-connected Kiwi Talks podcast has also suggested that Tanabe was behind the concept of the bike, which makes sense too. As big a swing as this seems like something from Nintendo. If the original plan was a far more far-reaching mechanic to promote openness, this seems like more of a compromise. You have a fixed open area, something Pokemon had tried to some success in Sword and Shield, released in 2019, but traditional gameplay of the Metroid Prime style would exist outside of that. It was a safety-first approach to be sure, but clearly the franchise was in need of a bit of safety, and it still represented a fairly significant experiment to add an area of openness into Metroid. The question to me is, when was the bike, and indeed when was the open area to ride it in, initiated? I can see a few versions of how this could have played out. Version 1 is that the 2019 conception of Metroid Prime 4 was incredibly traditional and safe, but at some point, perhaps around 2022, the top brass at Nintendo realized it was going to be a launch window game for the new system and asked Tanabe to extend development to include something that at least tilted at the kind of openness they wanted to show for their new system. I have thoughts addressed in the spoiler section of this video on how the desert may have been added in late in the production compared to some other elements, though I don't think the bike was necessarily, and therefore probably the concept of some kind of open area was in the offing since at least around 2022. At any rate, Nintendo's wish to include an open area does make some sense in terms of trying to broaden its appeal. If the game had really just been the 5 areas from the game as it stands, these are all fairly internal and potentially would have made the game feel small in scale. Fine for a late-in-life Switch game, problematic for a major console launcher. Another option is that the bike was always considered a prospective feature, but the desert itself was not. It's frankly quite difficult to imagine anyone pitching the idea of Samus riding around a big open desert as intrinsically fun, but it's easy to imagine the pitch of her riding between locations, thereby joining 5 disparate locations into one cohesive world. But the trouble is, this had to be a Switch game. On Switch 2, you could imagine Retro, with a good amount of time to put in, finding a way to show a seamless transition between the jungle biome of Fury Green and the mountainous regions of Icebelt and Flamepool, a small but interesting open world. But generating this level of detail on the original Switch, surely a very tough ask. By probably around 2023 or 2024, it would have been clear that this open area was the most problematic aspect, and so the ambition of the interstitial areas was stripped right back to the far simpler lighting and obstacles represented by the desert. Given the difference in polish between Sol Valley and the rest of the world, it seems plausible to me that the desert was the reason the game did not launch in September 2025, meaning that Nintendo had an uncharacteristic gap month during a time where they traditionally have at least one title release. It also meant that there was a period of 7 months between Nintendo Switch 1 games, which again seems counterintuitive to the way they normally work. If the desert was a major stumbling block for the production of Metroid Prime 4, added in fairly late during production, possibly to replace a more immersive first tilt at this same kind of thing, there is a precedent at Nintendo. It's not completely uncommon for Nintendo's grasp to exceed their reach in this way. Skyward Sword, Tears of the Kingdom, Mario Kart World, all games which feature large areas which seem to be received as broadly a little bit empty. It strikes me that it's probably relatively easy to generate the areas in themselves. The depths in Tears of the Kingdom was just the map of the surface inverted, and Hidemaru Fujibashi has said it didn't take them that long to produce. Actually populating that area, though, with meaningful content is a far more complex proposition. Again, I will return to this theme in the spoiler section at the end of the video. One note of caution at this point. I always think there's a massive risk in assuming that the features that players don't like were due to some kind of external problems. I have several times in the comments made the observation that it's far more likely the design choices by Nintendo were simply what Nintendo wanted, and even if their execution left something to be desired, it's reflective of their honest efforts rather than grand conspiracy. However, the bike sections do stand out to me. You can draw your own conclusions as to how much of a reach I'm making here by suggesting that they were late additions. Nevertheless, while Nintendo does give its developers a lot of grace, Retro did have a hard deadline ahead of them, December 2025. To delay Metroid Prime 4 once would look like misfortune, but to delay it having waited so long to announce a date would seem catastrophic, especially at such a sensitive moment in the Switch 2's rollout. The massive and costly advertising strategy required a Metroid Prime 4 release, and having it released beyond December would have been problematic. Now, I have some sympathy with Retro here because although the perception is that this game has been on full-on development for 9 years, the reality is that the long time to get the concept right, time that on other games may well overlap a prior production, meant that the full team probably had only around 4 years. Now, this is a significant amount of time, but it's not, say, Tears of the Kingdom time. Also, the team is not nearly as large as Tears of the Kingdom or even Breath of the Wild's was. At any rate, Metroid Prime 4 released in December in the end of the year Nintendo slot, which is basically reserved for Nintendo's games where they're desperate to get them out during the financial year and before the holiday season, but where development is quite tight. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate are two prior examples of just this kind of thing. Remember, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 had a lot of graphical patches after launch. Advance Wars 1 Plus 2 Reboot Camp was also at one stage a December game before it was booted out to April, and then to the following April. Retro presumably were doing stuff on the game until quite late on, with a day one patch for amiibo support and some difficulty tweaks. However, the game was finally wrapped, and by now Tanabe and Retro will be looking to the future. Metroid Prime's reception has been decidedly mixed. It's unlikely to take full advantage of its Prime positioning, but hopefully it will continue to sell across the Switch 2 generation. There will almost certainly be a 2D Metroid game within the next 18 months as well, given that Mercury Steam's Dread team haven't been credited in their independent title, and the success of Dread was fairly unambiguous. They wouldn't have wanted to have Metroid 6 step on any Prime 4 toes during the launch window of the Nintendo Switch 2. The focus really needed to be on Prime. But an announcement next summer, a bit like Samus Returns announcements 10 months after Federation Force launched, would make sense for Metroid 6. Also, with the heavy lifting of creating a Metroid Prime game completed, the 133 people strong studio is now up to speed, and, all things being equal, Nintendo also know a thing or two about how to make games on time and on budget. This may seem like a ridiculous thing to say after the experience of Metroid Prime 4, but I would argue that Metroid Prime 4 does show clear budgetary restraint in places, and even a major title like Mario Kart World is actually relatively restrained given the time that was evidently put into it. I think a strong model for what they might want to achieve is the Xenoblade games. These titles are ultra niche and appeal far more to one particular region, in this case Japan. The sales of their major titles are in the low millions, but they are also well regarded and serve as excellent graphical showcases. Having these kinds of prestige games on the system shows a breadth of content from Nintendo even if these specific games aren't huge sellers, and of course, these games are meant to be ones that Nintendo can continue to profit from indefinitely, meaning that if the company ever does manage to figure out how to launch Metroid into the big leagues, a major film perhaps, their back catalogue could suddenly become hugely valuable to them, even if it isn't at the moment. Therefore, I really don't think it's in Nintendo's interests to clip Metroid's wings, but I do think they will reflect on the remit of what they're asking Metroid to do. I could see a world where a Xenoblade model for Metroid Prime games makes a lot of sense. In each 5 to 6 year window, release a remaster and then an original game. Metroid Prime 2 Remaster was heavily hinted at by Tanabe in the recent book, and the potential to explore multiplayer has an obvious appeal to Nintendo's current aim to push game chat and online multiplayer. If that game drops in, let's say, mid-2028, it could then be followed by Prime 5 in 2030 or 2031. By that time, we would likely be in a post-Tanabe era, and since the only senior leaders to have taken Metroid on for the last 3 decades are Yoshio Sakamoto and Kensei Tanabe, Prime 5 could really go in one of two major directions. Option 1 is that they treat Retro largely like they treat Monolith Soft and assume that their new leading trio of Bill Vandervoort, Johnny Lundstedt, and Eric Sebesta can operate with a fair degree of autonomy from Nintendo's Kyoto base, probably coordinated by Risa Tabata, Tanabe's longtime number 2 as producer, but someone whose credits always appear to focus more on the logistical than the creative. Notably, Tabata did get her first ever producer credit on The Thousand Year Door in 2024. If Nintendo feel that Retro have reached a point where they can be trusted to be Prime's version of Monolith Soft after such a long period of chaos, it would bode well for Prime's future, and I don't necessarily think either the reviews or the sales of Prime 4 will be devastating to this endeavour. After all, Skyward Sword was poorly received, but the same team under the leadership of Hidemaru Fujibayashi came back with Breath of the Wild 5 and a bit years later, not just to tremendous critical acclaim, but also to huge sales. Nintendo didn't build Retro up to this degree only to tear them down, because a minority of game reviewers gave the game anemic scores, even though many gave it a very positive reception. In this case, I suspect the series will probably remain quite conservative and probably closer to what core fans want. After all, Nintendo are very influenced by their audience. The Zelda developers often talk about how they've absorbed feedback from prior titles, and Metroid Prime's player base is mostly English language. I am absolutely sure the team understands the response, and if the task is basically to do a medium-cost, medium-sales boutique game, then they need to just double down on the quality. Option 2 is that Nintendo decide that the problem was that they tried to do a halfway house and tried to renew Metroid in a far more major way once again. I can hear the screams in the comment section already, and I know the history of these kinds of things haven't been good with Metroid, but I would urge you to consider that Nintendo has managed this effectively in the past. Shiro Mori came over from the 2D Zelda team to shepherd Super Mario Bros. Wonder to great acclaim, but he also had former 3D Mario producer Koichi Hayashida helping him out. Just this year, we saw a bold new take on Donkey Kong, which was largely received with huge positivity, and while the game was piloted and significant development took place under the Super Mario Odyssey team, they ultimately hired Kazuya Takahashi in 2020 to take the game to the finish line. It's not impossible with the talent that resides within Nintendo that they could find a new direction for Metroid that ends up being Samus's Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Bros. Wonder, their breakout game that really brings back the core appeal that the series always had, but expresses it for a new generation. But it does seem tricky, and frankly it's not clear that many people at Nintendo's heart are really that passionate about the series, given that it's been in the hands of Western developers for so long, and with relatively small and long-standing Japanese crews, many of whom have been with Metroid for literally decades. I think, therefore, they're more likely to go with option 1. Now, this isn't without problems. For one thing, it commits them to a series that is a real bubble franchise without any particular plan to expand it at the time being. For another, the talented individuals of Retro may well feel that working on a treadmill of Metroid titles could lack creative stimulation, especially if Metroid Prime 4 isn't perceived as having the kind of prestige that they might have hoped for. However, Retro's size is such that they can continue to grow it to the point where they can once again prototype multiple projects. Donkey Kong is obviously a major concern of Nintendo's right now, with an almost certain upcoming film, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's a significant group working on a 2D Donkey Kong game somewhere at Nintendo, and very possibly at Retro. Also, Iron Galaxy have previous on remastered games, so having them take a significant lead on Metroid Prime 2 Remastered would free up the core team considerably. Next Level Games is also expanding drastically, and their skills at cartoony animation would lend itself well to Donkey Kong Country. Retro supported Bandai Namco Singapore, and so even if they don't lead a new Donkey Kong Country project themselves, they may well be able to either support the development of a Donkey Kong 2D title from Next Level Games, or even Nintendo Software Technology in Redmond. Even if there's skepticism about continuing on the Metroid train, Nintendo do tend to get their own way with even their most valuable creative people. EPD's number 2 Yoshiki Koizumi spent much of his career trying to do imaginative, original games, only to be pulled by the nose back to the core Nintendo franchises. His pitch for a time travel game with cops and robbers became Majora's Mask, and when he moved to Tokyo, the team were assigned first Donkey Kong Jungle Beat and then Super Mario Galaxy by Miyamoto, even though they had aspired to do something original. Part of the reason all this works is that Nintendo actually do challenge their creators to do different things within a game series, and I think there remains huge scope to reimagine Prime without stapling a Hyrule field onto it. I also find it difficult to believe that Prime 4, which was always held back slightly by Switch hardware, is the ceiling of Retro's ambitions for modern Prime, and I expect that most of the people hired recently were brought on board with the clear steer that they wanted a big future for the Prime games. As the dust settles, I will track back to specific forecasting, but this is all very long-term stuff. More details may arise, and there's significant amount of guesswork to fill in the blanks here, so for now, I'm going to leave the core part of the video, but pivot to discussing spoiler elements of the game. At this point, if you want to avoid spoilers, and I recommend that you do because these include some very big ones indeed, I'll say thank you so much for watching. But otherwise, let's just flesh out this deep dive with a few reflections on what the game's structure and ending may well tell us about the development of Metroid Prime 4. First of all, let's consider the bike and the desert. We can probably trace the bike to a fairly early point because Vault Forge has the bike embedded into pretty much every facet of its design. Even if we grant that Vault Forge was the last of the major areas to be designed, by the time it was designed, it would have become incredibly difficult to have such a substantial part of the game filled with bike imagery and then not include the actual bike. Therefore, I suspect that the bike was a relatively early aspect of production, even though I think they hadn't settled on the final form of the open area or possibly of the vehicle to ride it on yet. Now, relatively early is obviously a relative term. It may have been that Vault Forge was the last area developed and that they knew that Samus would be riding on a machine of some kind, but its final specifics weren't yet nailed down. That would make a lot of sense. It's even possible that Vault Forge was adapted to include the bikes, but at an earlier point. If we assume the bike was added after development began, I struggle to think it could have been much later than 2022. Still, I find it conspicuous that View is added so late on and in a level dedicated not to any individual Force member or even a double act like Duke and Armstrong. Was there a different level? A level that used the bike as a core component that also focused on the introduction of the robot View? Or perhaps there was an existing level that ultimately had to be adapted to remove some of these elements? Isn't it odd that Vault Forge alone lacks a Federation Force companion? What if Vault Forge was originally making robots and Mackenzie suggests going there to help find and fix up View? This would feel far more germane to the careful and intricate world building than this alien world randomly making motorbikes. For the desert though, note how much of the desert game time is taking place at the very end of the game, after the Great Mines, which appears to be the final major section. You might justifiably say that this doesn't mean anything. Games don't need to be developed chronologically after all. But actually, in something as tightly constructed as a Metroid title, you do need the chronology to be front of mind. If you develop something for mid-game, it's effectively locked into mid-game because you need that element to be part of the overall experience and to work within the overall progression and the challenge level and abilities of the player at that particular point. Therefore, if you have an element that's tricky to pin down, where would you put it when developing a Metroidvania? Why, at the very end. This way, the rest of the game can take shape unimpeded, and the open area to link the zones can be figured out when the time comes. This leads on to another issue I've seen that people have, the ending with its real downer quality. Now, if we assume that the Great Mines was meant to be the final area, a huge amount then makes sense. Note how the Amiga Griever appears relatively early in the Great Mines, but the final fight isn't until later. Well, trailing enemies is something Metroid has done on occasion, but what if the Amiga Griever was originally a mid-level boss, and then at the end we got not the final form of the Amiga Griever, but Silex? The game paces out the same as it does in the actual title up until this point, with the Federation soldiers making the ultimate sacrifice for Samus one after the other and allowing her to continue on with her deadly mission. Only at the end, when Silex is defeated and Samus returns home, can she reflect on all the people that have been lost. The cutscene from the end of the game, which for all we know was commissioned years ago and couldn't be changed, or at least not without great expense, still works perfectly. The game absolutely propels itself to the finish line, and there's a genuine tragedy about how these characters died in the heat of battle. Now assume that in perhaps 2023 or 2024, the original open area was not working. Perhaps the original open area was just stuttery and unplayable on the original Switch. Perhaps elements of the gameplay didn't work. Assume a new Hyrule Field type area needed to be created in a jiffy, and there'd better be staff to doing it. Now, there'd be no earlier spot to put this without breaking the carefully planned progression of the game, and so it goes at the end. But what does this mean? Look, if you've ever done a creative project, you've probably had the experience of trying to improve something but ending up overworking it and actually detracting from what you originally had. The story of Metroid Prime 4 feels to me like the victim of this kind of process. Their carefully crafted, ultra-tense ending was now just a late-stage section. The Federation Force troopers didn't end up dying grisly deaths in the mines, but pop back up like whack-a-moles, chirpies alike, for no plausible reason. They're granted a reprieve because they're needed for the desert section, and a new finale is created. Chrono Tower is added, and now instead of Silex haunting Samus through the game, he's sleeping in a healing pod in Chrono Tower. But somehow this gives him the ability to control things and make robot versions of himself to attack Samus. This mechanism is never explained, and it strikes me that this could well be because it was never the plan that the first two Silex battles were robot duplicates. Originally, we'd face Silex 3 times, and the final one, in the mines, would be the ending to a cataclysmic final run where Samus and her newfound allies went to their deaths, all except Samus, of course. However, the ending is the ending. The cutscenes were likely already produced, and in any event, Kensuke Tanabe had had in mind the final moments of this title for nearly 2 decades. He knows this game ends with Samus alone and mourning the lost soldiers. So, the troopers needed to fight alongside Samus in the final battle, even though this escort mechanic isn't the strongest in the game, and they needed to meet their terrible fates, even though it requires a series of plot contrivances to explain why Samus is yet again leaving them all to die. There's no time to give them each grace moment, and even if there were, this had already been done in the Great Mines, so the only other option would be to have them sacrifice themselves and add in moments where we see their faces, despite this being the heat of battle, and so revealing their faces really doesn't make much sense. None of this, in fact, makes a lick of internal logic to me, but if you assume that it was all, so to speak, retro-engineered to get back to the flavour of the original ending before an open-world area was added in, then it starts to fall into place. Now, I don't know that any of this is true. It may just be absolutely wild speculation, but the more I think about it, the more I believe that the Great Minds was the original ending. I think the game was designed to emulate the original Alien movie, as the series has so often done before, and put Samus as the final girl who survives the terrifying monster encounters once again, with the allies she has so carefully cultivated being picked off one by one. The player becomes so immersed in the game that it's only after the final battle is complete that we have the chance to look back and realise and mourn that the soldiers are all gone, and that when Samus leaves the planet, she is, once again, alone. But what do you think? Do watch out for my separate response video to Metroid Prime 4, where I'll go through my own thoughts in a lot more detail. Thank you for watching, and please consider checking out the Patreon for early ad-free and exclusive content, and to support the channel. There are some cool videos on screen that you might want to check out, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.